In today's video, we're going to be talking about keeping Lake Malawi African cichlids together, specifically Peacock cichlids and Mbuna. We get this question in our comments and our DMs all the time, so we figured we'd make a full video on this topic, whether or not you can keep these together successfully, or if you should keep them together. I'm going to walk through some considerations for and against keeping them together. This can also be a bit controversial as everyone seems to have their own opinion, but I'm still excited to talk about it today, so let's dive right in. So first off, we are talking about cichlids from Lake Malawi, which consists of Mbuna, Peacocks, and haps. Today we're going to focus on Mbuna and Peacocks, as that is one of the most common questions that we get on whether or not you can mix these in a tank together. And right off the bat, one of the most positive things about keeping them in a tank together is that they share the same water chemistry. Mbuna and Peacocks do really well with higher pH and harder water, so they definitely share that characteristic, and if their tank has that environment, they should do really well. They can also stay in the same temperature range, again because they come from the same lake. The other positive of keeping Mbuna and Peacocks together is that they are from Lake Malawi, so it is almost like a biotope, a natural setup of having these fish coexist. This is something you would actually find in their natural environment, having a mix of these fish, so it is a really cool aspect. It's something a lot of hobbyists evolve into, is keeping a more natural aquascape with more of a focus on their real environment and the types of fish you would see there. A lot of people are against keeping South American cichlids with African cichlids just simply because they're not from the same area, and it's just not a natural tank setup, even though those cichlids can sometimes coexist. But for Mbuna and Peacocks, it can almost be a biotope if you set it up in the right way. So those were a few reasons why Mbuna and Peacocks could go together. Now let's talk about some of the considerations you definitely want to look out for. These really break out into three primary concerns, and I'm going to start with maybe the least concern to one of the biggest issues I have when keeping these fish together. So first, it's important, I think, to talk about aggression. And when it comes to Mbuna, they do stay smaller than the Peacocks, but usually they will be a very feisty fish, and in most cases they will be more aggressive than the Peacocks or haps, and sometimes can bully those bigger fish. That could really be a bummer if you have this Peacock cichlid growing up, you're wanting it to have that great color, but you have some Mbuna harassing it. Maybe it has nipped up fins and just washed out color, and it's really defeating the purpose of keeping the Peacock cichlids. You have to be very careful with the type of Mbuna you pick, because if you have something like the Aratus, the Bumblebee, even the Johanni, some of these guys can be just really feisty and really pick on bigger tank mates. You might have a little more success with some of your more peaceful Mbuna, like your Yellow Lab, your Rusty Cichlid, even your Yellowtail ACI and Solosi. Those could be on the more peaceful end when it comes to Mbuna, but then they might be picked on by the Peacocks. So this really can be an issue. Of course, all cichlids have their own personalities, so you might have a rogue species, or you might have one that's typically aggressive that isn't in your tank. And if that's the case, by all means, keep doing what you're doing, but this can definitely be an issue for most people. A lot of times with African cichlids, you'll see overstocked tanks, which can help dilute some of that aggression. I think that's most important when keeping Mbuna, just because they can be so aggressive and feisty towards any tank mates. With things like your Peacocks and haps, I don't think overstocking is quite as important, but I still think it's a good strategy if you're trying to mitigate that aggression. Also, I think tank size can definitely play into the aggression levels of these fish. Usually the Mbuna staying a little bit smaller. You could even get some species that go in a 40-gallon breeder and have a nice colony of Solosi, for instance. Or you could do a 55 or 75-gallon tank and just have a really good mixed Mbuna tank setup, and that's usually enough space for them. But for Peacock cichlids, they need much more swimming space, much more open water swimmers, and so I wouldn't recommend anything lower than a 75-gallon tank. But if you're going below these minimums, you're just trying to squeeze some Mbuna and Peacocks together in a small tank, you're definitely going to have elevated aggression. A lot of times when people come to us with questions, we have to ask their tank size and the cichlids that are in there. And I would say 90% of the time their tank is too small, which leads to bad parameters, not enough territory in the tank, and if you're trying to mix things like Mbuna and Peacocks, it just leads to more and more issues. So it's definitely important to consider your tank size, see if it's even big enough in the first place to mix these fish, because then you'll set yourself up for success when it comes to aggression between the two categories. So getting into the second concern of keeping these fish together is just their diet. Mbuna cichlids typically need more vegetable matter in their diet, and if they get too much protein, they can develop diseases, especially with Malawi bloat. When it comes to your Peacocks or even your haps, they require more protein in their diet, so if you're constantly feeding your tank just vegetable matter, your Peacocks probably won't grow or color up like they normally would. But on the flip side, if you're feeding your tank with a lot of protein-based foods like I do with my peacocks in this tank, then you could really run into issues with your Mbuna having too much protein and developing that bloat, which can be some big issues down the line. So maybe you've kept these cichlids together for a year or so and you've had success. I would just be very concerned with the diet that they've had, because over time that could really lead to these issues. So if you've had that tank already set up, I would just really consider the diet and how you can alter it to make sure your Mbuna and your peacocks are as healthy as possible. And then if you're a beginner and you're considering mixing Mbuna and peacocks, I would just really consider if you're going to be able to target feed effectively, if you're going to get the more vegetable-based diet down to the Mbuna versus protein-based diet at the top of your peacocks. That's why I would consider mixing Mbuna and peacocks more of your intermediate or even advanced level of fish keeping, because you might need to do things like target feed. If you have a really big tank, you might be able to feed your peacocks on one end and then sneak down food to your Mbuna, but it's really going to be difficult to control exactly what you're giving your fish. And I'm just mentioning that it's not ideal for the Mbuna or the peacocks, but like I said, it definitely has been done. You just really need to consider their diet and how you're going to feed these fish over the long term. So getting into my third concern about keeping Mbuna and peacocks together, this is really the biggest one for me, and a lot of times people overlook this, and that is just the tank setup needs and requirements for each of the different categories. Mbuna cichlids are rock dwellers. They need plenty of rock work and structures in their aquarium to behave naturally, to establish territories. It's also fun to watch Mbuna swim in and out of rocks and crevices. Your ideal setup for Mbuna will have a big aquascape with a ton of rocks.
Sometimes I guess there just aren't enough rocks.
And on the other side, peacock cichlids are much more open water swimmers, and if you put all those different rocks and structures in your tank, you're taking away a lot of that open water swimming space for your peacocks. The ideal tank setup for peacocks will have pretty minimal aquascape like I have here in my 75-gallon tank. I just have a few rock structures here, but if I added too much decor, not only would it reduce their swimming space, but peacocks and haps start claiming territory in the tank if there's decor, and that can actually lead to more aggression for your peacocks and haps. So you're definitely between a rock and a hard place, pun intended.
I thought my jokes were bad.
Because the ideal tank setup for your Mbuna is very different from your peacocks. If you put a lot of rocks in your tank that the Mbuna would enjoy, you're really going to be taking away from the peacocks. And if you go with a more minimal aquascape for the peacocks, you're really going to put the Mbuna in harm's way and not be able to see their natural behavior of swimming in and out of rocks, claiming territories, and interacting with each other in a more natural way. And there's not really a way around this in terms of the ideal tank setup when keeping Mbuna and peacocks. I feel like one of the categories is going to be slighted no matter how you set up your tank. Maybe if you have a very big tank, you could add enough rocks for the Mbuna without taking space away from the peacocks, but overall you're going to be making a conscious choice on which category of cichlid that you're going to be favoring, whether you add a lot of rock work for the Mbuna or keep it more minimal for the peacocks. And even if you go in between, you're probably hurting both sides of it. So it really is a tough situation, and I'm sure a lot of you have had success keeping them in different types of setups. All I'm saying is that it's not going to be ideal for one of the categories of fish, no matter how you slice it. So in review, there's definitely some positives of trying to keep these fish together. They come from the same lake, they have the same water parameters and chemistry, so that's all great, but there are some definite concerns when it comes to aggression, their varying diets, and also just their tank setup and aquascape that you have to go with. So personally, if someone asked me if they should keep Mbuna and peacocks together, I would usually recommend against doing so, especially if they're a beginner. If they're an immediate or advanced level fish keeper that's been in the hobby for many years, I would just say to keep all these considerations in mind. Try and mitigate the aggression the best you can, try and target feed to get around their varying diets, and just know that your tank setup's not going to be ideal for one of the categories of fish. And if you're okay with all that, I'm sure you could get by, especially if you have a large enough tank and you can kind of get by some of these issues. And as a last thought here, if you are trying to mix different species, I would actually lean towards peacocks and haps, since they have very similar behaviors in terms of open water swimming space and a very similar diet. I think they can definitely go well in a tank as long as you have a 6-foot tank or larger. Peacocks, common haps, and haps might be a much better mix. But if you have a smaller tank and you're trying to mix fish, I would just be very careful about picking your peacocks and Mbuna, and then maybe just stick to Mbuna only if you have a smaller aquarium. So there it is. I think I covered it all. I'm sure there's going to be lots of opinions on whether or not you should keep Mbuna and peacocks together. Like I said, some of you probably have had success, But just keep an eye out for all these different considerations over time, especially if you've only had the tank running for a year or so, because these fish do live a very long time. You want to make sure they're as happy and healthy as possible. So let us know if you agree, disagree, or what your experience has been. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time.